Eva stared out the windshield into the sea of black trees rushing past. Their limbs clawed at the car like bony fingers grabbing at the fading light. An intense storm had rolled in as they drove deeper into the remote forest, slowing their progress to a crawl. She glanced at John gripping the wheel, his knuckles stark white against the gloom. The endless downpour and howling wind rattled the vehicle. Eva knew he was just as eager as her to get off these treacherous mountain roads before nightfall swallowed them whole. Her fiancé was far less comfortable with the idea of camping in such an isolated part of the forest, but she had convinced him it would be a memorable adventure. At last, the trees thinned and John steered onto a muddy track leading to their campsite. As the engine died, a heavy silence descended in the wake of the storm's fury. They sat listening to the drip of water off the leaves as dusk crept through the woods. "I still think this was a bad idea coming out here," John said quietly. Eva squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Don't worry. Once we get a fire going, you'll feel better. It'll be romantic." They climbed out into ankle-deep mud and set to work pitching their tent by the fading light of John's flashlight. A shadow shifted at the edge of the beam, and Eva nearly jumped out of her skin until she realized it was just a curious raccoon. When full darkness fell, the dancing firelight revealed trees looming over them like silent sentinels. Strange noises echoed through the forest, an owl's mournful call, the scurry of nocturnal creatures. The solitude was soothing after their long drive. As Eva nestled into her sleeping bag, John banked the fire for the night. He climbed in beside her, though she noticed the nervous set of his shoulders, even in the faint glow seeping through the tent walls. Suddenly, a snap of a breaking branch shattered the stillness. They froze, straining to listen. "Probably just a deer," Eva whispered, though her words did little to ease the tension coiling in her stomach. Another sound, a soft crunch of fallen leaves, as if something was circling their camp. John's breathing quickened, and he gripped her hand tighter. Eva opened her mouth to calm him, but froze at the unmistakable scuff of boots on soil right outside the tent. John met her wide eyes, mouth set in a pale line. Neither dared make a sound as their hearts pounded in unison. Heavy breathing, as of an unseen watcher, drifted to their straining ears. Eva swore she glimpsed movement dart just beyond the fluttering walls. Terror closed her throat as the presence lingered far too long. At last, whatever unseen stalker lurked out there padded away into the forest depths. Eva didn't dare close her eyes the rest of that dreadful night, half expecting their phantom visitor to return. She and John clung together, jumping at every creak and rustle permeating the dark reaches surrounding their fragile shelter. By dawn's pale light, Eva was exhausted, yet glad to escape this cursed place. But as they crawled from the tent, Eva's blood ran cold. Fresh tracks imprinted the muddy ground, long gashes of claw marks forming an unbroken circle around their campsite. She and John stared at each other, the same chilling realization dawning in their wide eyes. They were not alone in these oppressive woods. Something was watching. It was still dark when Eva stirred John awake, a tremor in her whisper. "We need to leave. Now." Without question, John dressed in haste as Eva packed. The tracks had unnerved them both, yet neither spoke their fears aloud. Soon the forest seemed to close in, their solitary tent a beacon for whatever prowled these unforgiving woods. The engine sputtered to life, grateful salvation. But as John shifted gears, headlights swept over movement, a pale shape retreating into the sinister brush. He hit the brakes just as Eva screamed. Craning out the window, they saw nothing but swaying boughs, waiting to swallow their secrets. "They'll go." Eva slapped the dash, her panic contagious. With a lurch, they shot down the track, branches clawing the flanks like grasping hands. No sooner had dawn tinted the dreary sky than an unearthly glow flickered in the rear view. Green, sickly radiance that did not belong to this world. John's breath caught as it emerged from the trees, gaining their trail. "What is it?" Eva rasped, white-knuckled on the door. John shook his head, jaw clamped tight. He pressed the gas pedal to the floor, though the SUV seemed to crawl before this new terror. The light drifted low along their back bumper as if drawn to their fright. "Faster!" Eva shrieked, a malevolent emanation filling the mirror. They rounded a bend just as the glow burst like an explosion of putrid luminescence. But the rumble that followed shook them to the core, an animalistic roar that echoed through the forest, defiant and ravenous. Whatever pursued needed only one bound to overtake their vehicle. John scrabbled for the walkie in the glove box. "Help! This is John and Eva. Repeat. We need emergency assistance. Over." Static was the sole reply. Eva took another glance behind just as a colossal figure emerged from the fog of light. Impossibly tall, hulking mass, balanced on digitigrade limbs, ending in taloned paws the size of dinner plates. It bore down on them with sinewy strides, teeth bared in a nightmarish maw, pale eyes lambent with bloodlust, and, shadowed within that hellish gaze, recognition. "It sees us!" Eva screamed, her mind refusing this aberration. Fear flooded John's every synapse, yet resolve gripped his steering with iron. Eyes ahead, he swerved toward a narrow trail snaking into denser woodland, a chance to lose their tracker in the thick brush and confusing terrain. The monster veered off the main road in swift pursuit, crashing through saplings and tearing aside undergrowth with abandon. They hurtled down the treacherous hill, ditching gravel with perilous speed. But around the bend loomed a yawning gorge, bridged by a rotting log, too weathered for their speeding car. John slammed the brakes, and the SUV screeched into a fishtailing stop, inches from the precipice. Behind them arose the crunch of snapping wood. Their pursuer was gaining the ridge. John and Eva burst from the doomed vehicle with a final plea. "Help us!" Their flight or death sprint had begun deep in these unforgiving mountains, the ghostly wail of the monster nigh on their heels, into the enshrouding dark. John and Eva plunged blindly into the dense forest, branches whipping their skin. Behind, the beast's shriek shook the ancient trees, a roar promising violence. They dared not look back at their fate closing in, feet pounding the leafy loam in a desperate bid to outrun the impossible. At last, Eva stumbled over gnarled roots, tumbling down a steep slope blanketed in carpet of pine needles. John grabbed her arm to break the fall, pain shooting through his wrist as they crashed against thick trunks. They lay panting, listening with held breath as twigs snapped under lumbering footfalls scouring the ridge above. The monster had lost their trail. For now, Eva met John's grim expression, beyond words, to convey the horror of their plight. All pretense of rationality fled in the face of this abomination stalking their every move. He pulled her up the incline toward a clearing, just as clouds rolled in, promising another downpour to shroud their elusive quarry. They limped along in shocked silence, seeking shelter and safety, though what refuge could be found from such a predator on its home terrain? It knew these woods intimately, an advantage compounding their vulnerability in this unforgiving wilderness. Finally, a rocky overhang emerged through the mist, and they huddled in its meager cover, taking stock of injuries. John's wrist swelled angrily, but seemed intact. More cuts and bruises dotted Eva's legs and arms from her fall. Their resources consisted of a half-filled canteen and a pocket knife. Pitiful defenses against the towering beast that yet hunted their scent on the mist-cloaked wind. Darkness fell swiftly as thunder rumbled in the distance. John dug out his dripping cell with numbed fingers, hoping for a miracle of signal in this isolated range. To his astonishment, 3 flickering bars appeared. Hands shaking, he dialed 911 before reception faded, but was cut off by the operator's panic demands for their location. "We have to go back," Eva whispered, desperation lending urgency to her wavering voice. What if others are lost out there like us? We can't just run. John grabbed her arms, pleading with his eyes for reason. It's suicide. We'll never survive another encounter. Please, once the rain lets up, we go for help. But Eva had made up her mind, doggedly tracking their route back through the downpour. Her conscience refused to leave mysteries unsolved when others might still cling to life. John shadowed reluctantly, every cracking twig twisting his stomach into knots. At last, they stumbled into a familiar clearing. All that remained was their totaled SUV, equipment scattered and doors hanging open, where the creature had sniffed their scents. John surveyed the devastation, his worst fears confirmed. Eva shouldered on to comb the area for any sign pointing to the monster's intentions or previous victims. Through the drizzle, something fluttered in the grasping branches ahead. A sodden piece of cloth tangled in brambles, imprinted with a name half washed away. Airy. With dread, Eva extracted an even grimmer discovery. A long-expired ID, belonging to Gary Thompson, listed as missing in these very mountains years ago. The implications hollowed her out as John squeezed her arm, his pale face betraying he'd pieced together the same horrific truth. This was no isolated incident. Whatever stalked these woods was no stranger to hunting humans. Their only chance was unraveling the mysteries lurking in the darkness before it was too late. The downpour slowed to a drizzle as evening fell. John pleaded once more for Eva to reconsider her fool's mission, but her mind was set. With a bitter kiss goodbye, he watched her fade into the murky woodlands, praying she wouldn't become another lost soul swallowed by this place of shadows. Eva crept stealthily, pausing at every creak of branches weighed by rain. Her encounter with that disturbing-eyed raised more questions than answers. She had to uncover the truth, whatever nightmares lurked concealed in this brooding forest. The campsite appeared through the fog like a ghostly mirage. All signs of their ordeal were washed away, as if trying to obscure the sinister events that unfolded here. Eva scanned the mud for any remaining clues, flinching at imagined sounds. A scuffling stirred the bushes behind her tent. She whipped around, blood freezing at the sight of fabric fluttering just above the tree line. Someone, or something, was watching from the shadows. Her pulse deafened any chance of discerning its presence. Slowly, ever so slowly, Eva backed toward the entrance, snatching up a fallen branch for defense. A twig snapped. She spun to face gleaming eyes gleaming from the dark. Too big, too close. With a hiss, the monster exploded from the undergrowth in a blur of black fur and gnashing teeth. Eva shrieked and swung wildly, scoring a futile blow to its snout before it overpowered her with its bulk. She was thrown to the ground, its rancid breath choking her screams for mercy. This was no wild animal, for in those feral eyes lurked a spark of malign sentience far beyond any natural predator. It pinned her wrists, peeling back hairy lips to reveal rank saliva, dripping long fangs. She struggled in vain against its crushing weight as death bared down, mad with bloodlust after their long pursuit. But before the killing blow fell, the creature's ears flicked up at a shout in the distance. John spotted the light from her phone long abandoned in the clearing. His heart stopped as its glow revealed tufts of dark hair and smears of blood sinking into the mud. No tracks led away, meaning only one merciless truth. It was still here. He snatched up her weapon and prowled the perimeter, fighting rising panic. A snap of twigs betrayed its position upwind, crouched over its fallen prey. With a roar of grief and rage, John burst from the tree line, brandishing the branch like a lance. The beast reared up from Eva's motionless body with a snarl, flecks of gore marring its muzzle. Recognition dawned in those soulless orbs. It knew this feeble human meant to stop its hunt. With a hiss, it stalked forward, saliva dripping its stained maw. John stood his ground, mind racing. This was no ordinary beast, but a twisted abomination violating the laws of nature. An impossible experiment born of this forest's darker mysteries and thirsting for their destruction. His eyes fell upon Eva, and resolve hardened to stone. One way or another, this nightmare ends tonight. With a guttural battle cry, he charged the towering monster amid the haunted pines, as the storm unleashed its fury once more upon the deadly chase, unfolding in that cursed wood. The forest path was nearly engulfed by shadow, as the sun dipped below the tree line. I hurried ahead of the others, eager to reach our campsite before nightfall. Though I'd looked forward to this weekend retreat for weeks, an unsettled energy now stirred in my stomach. The dense pine forest seemed to close in around us, each snap of a branch, eliciting an involuntary jolt. Our campsite finally emerged in a small clearing. As I helped unload the cars, Sarah paused to gaze into the darkening woods. "Creepy, being out here all alone, isn't it?" she said with a nervous laugh. I smiled in agreement, pushing down my own mounting unease. We worked efficiently to pitch the tents before dusk set in completely. Once settled around the crackling fire pit, relaxed conversation lifted the mood. Beer and s'mores tempered our city. Weary nerves. Sarah strummed her guitar, filling the clearing with folksy melodies. I watched the dancing flames, content to listen as easy banter flowed between my friends. John playfully heckled Steve, teasing him about an old bar story. Even Sarah's sing took on a lighter tone as shadows receded from our little orb of warmth and companionship. My bladder stirred me from comfortable silence sometime later. I stood, grabbing my flashlight, and told the others I'd return shortly. Stepping into the surrounding woods, emptiness pressed in from every direction. My flashlight beam illuminated little more than whirling moths and swirling shadow. I hurried through my business, unnerved by each small sound. As I made my way back to the clearing, a flicker of movement caught my eye between the tree trunks. I paused, straining to see more clearly in the darkness. A tall silhouette emerged in a small clearing up ahead, partially illuminated by moonlight. Long, wild hair whipped around a thin form as it moved in an odd, twitchy manner. "Sarah!" I called out tentatively. No response came, only more frenetic motion as the figure paced back and forth. Dread chilled my veins as chilling realization set in. Sarah had left the campfire in nothing but a thin shirt and leggings. What was she doing out here alone in the black of night? I took a step forward, my foot snapping a brittle twig. The silhouette spun toward me, rigid and alert. Two dark hollows gaped where a human face should be. A guttural exhale rushed from that endless void, sending my shocked mind reeling. I couldn't process what I saw, or didn't see, as my flight instincts seized control. Chest heaving, I crashed back to camp and blurted out what I'd just witnessed. The others dismissed my story as an overactive mind in the dark. But later, when we couldn't rouse Sarah from her tent, doubt set in, her zipper laid torn, flaps thrown wide to the night. Sarah was gone without a trace, disappearing into the deep, unknowable heart of the forest. The morning sun did little to lift our strained mood. Our campsite remained eerily still as the events of last night seeped in. Sarah's empty tent lay open like a wound, reminding us something was terribly wrong. John took charge, organizing our search methodically despite visibly fraying nerves. Steve grew agitated, insisting we simply leave while we still could. His logic held little solace as images of Sarah alone in these unforgiving woods haunted me. Setting out in pairs, we combed the surrounding forest. Broken branches and disturbed undergrowth hinted at Sarah's flight through the darkness. But the trail grew cold. By midday, a light rain began to fall. Our efforts doubled as hope faded with each passing minute. Back at camp, John and I found the place ransacked. Our supplies lay scattered, tents torn open to the dreary skies. Frayed wires indicated our generator had been violently dismantled. Steve's worried muttering grew more intense as his gaze darted between the trees. I backed away slowly, unnerved by his unraveling composure. That night, the rain fell heavier still. Huddled beside a meager fire, we listened to the downpour assaulting our tin roof. Steve spoke frantically of government plots and unseen watchers in the woods. John argued rationally while eyeing our friend with concern. I sat apart, numb to their debate as Sarah's fate played on repeat in my mind. Exhaustion overcame my fitful attempts at sleep. Rolling over, my eyes caught movement beyond the tent's wet canvas. A dark silhouette stood motionless at the tree line, backlit by the storm's eerie glow. Terror seized me as I scrambled from my tent on unsteady legs. But by the time I emerged, only rain and shadow remained in the woods. The next morning, Steve was missing from camp. His tent lay in shreds, as if ripped from within by desperate hands and claws. We searched hopelessly, barely keeping pace with the escalating chaos closing in from the woods. By midday, a chorus of voices joined the incessant rain, their source impossible to discern. Madness seemed poised to claim us all. When Sarah suddenly emerged from the tree line, we nearly collapsed in relief, but something was deeply wrong. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, movements jagged like a feral thing. She spoke of visions and threats from the forest in disjointed phrases before disappearing once more into the blur of rain and trees. Exhausted and fearful, John and I huddled near the dead campfire well into the night. The sound of the storm had taken on a nightmarish quality, as if forces beyond comprehension lurked just outside our feeble shelter, when a long, keening wail rose abruptly from the blackness. We knew our ordeal had only just begun. Something was very wrong in these woods, and it wanted us to know we weren't alone. The storm showed no signs of abating, as dawn brought only a murky, green-tinged light to the claustrophobic forest. John and I sat entombed within our huddled thoughts, paralyzed by fatigue and despair. Our rations had mostly disappeared along with our provisions. Without action, exposure and starvation seemed fates we could no longer outrun. Braving the downpour, we scoured our reduced encampment for any usable supplies. Inside Steve's ravaged tent lay scattered pages torn from a journal, their disjointed phrases raw with mounting hysteria. Voices coming from everywhere. Can't sleep. It never stops. Seeing things moving in the trees. His entries dissolved into illegible scribbles, as if fighting to relay truths too disturbing for conscious thought. Our search grew more desperate until a glint of color caught my eye from deep within the sodden underbrush. Pushing aside damp ferns revealed a grim discovery. Tangled in vegetation lay Steve's remains, limbs bent at unnatural angles. His face remained untouched, frozen in a mask of absolute primal terror. John hauled me shaking from the gnarled thicket before my mind could fully process the horror. We needed to leave. Now, gathering what little provisions remained, we headed due east, guided by moss on tree trunks. The forest seemed intent on disorienting us further, morphing terrain into a labyrinth devoid of landmarks. After hours of struggle, we stumbled upon a small break in the trees. A grisly scene awaited in the tiny clearing, another camp thoroughly pillaged yet recently occupied. Two ravaged bodies lay twisted among the wreckage, identities obscured by visceral mutilation. My stomach lurched at the carnage, a brutal glimpse into the fates stalking these accursed woods. We fled in horror, adrenaline conquering exhaustion for the time being. Breaking through the tree line, a tiny ramshackle structure emerged in another small clearing up ahead. Racing inside, we collapsed against the door, heaving for breath through cloying fear and nausea. Outside, the storm was beginning to recede, an eerie calm settling over the immense forest once more. Inside our dilapidated shelter, the walls were papered with scrawled notes and photographs, piecing together the remnants of a man seeking to document this forest's mysteries. We realized the horror was far from over. The entity had manipulated our friends' minds, puppeteering their violent ends to further some incomprehensible design. A crash startled us from shadows creeping the walls. Whirling around, violent madness blazed in Sarah's eyes as she hurled herself at us. Fingernails curled into talons. Paralyzed, we could only watch in mute horror as her fingers found purchase around my neck. John's panicked cry was cut short by a gurgling gasp behind me. Their combined weight sent the rotting door crashing open beneath us. The rain had stopped, yet an unholy green glow illuminated the massive trees stretching endlessly in every direction. An inhuman howl rose gradually to a deafening crescendo miles away, answered by countless echoes closing in from the forest. I fled blindly into the oppressive, dark, primal instinct, all that remained to guide my terror. Behind, the chorus of anguished screams told me my friends had met their final fates. Crashing without destination through the clutching undergrowth, my foot caught on something solid hidden in the leaf litter. Sprawling forward, my fingers wrapped around a discarded flare gun. Its red paint nearly faded to nothing. Dark rain clouds broke as the full moon shone down, revealing a shadowed forest clearing up ahead. Within stood a towering, twisting mass of gnarled limbs and branches. Taking on an crudely humanoid shape, two black voids glared down from its angular head, malicious intent pouring from their depths. Its haunting howl rose once more as twisting tendrils shot toward me with snake-like speed. On instinct, I squeezed the trigger of the flare gun clutched in shaking hands. A brilliant flash lit the clearing, momentarily blinding all wind from the searing light. When my vision returned, the entity had vanished, leaving only charred earth and lingering wisps of acrid smoke in its wake. Collapsing into damp leaves, I knew my torment was at last over. Dawn would bring rescue or the sweet release of death's embrace. But for now, I was alone. This forest's mysteries and the malevolent force binding it remained shrouded in darkness, perhaps slumbering once more until its call could not be denied. My ordeal was done, yet as the moon slipped behind gathering clouds, an unsettled certainty lingered. This place was not finished with our kind. The old logging trail twisted deep into the valley, winding its way between thick stands of pine and fir. Sam White gripped the steering wheel tight, navigating their truck through the narrow dirt path. "Are we almost there?" asked Melissa from the passenger seat, peering out at the dense greenery creeping in on either side. "According to the map, our campsite should be just up ahead," Sam replied, slowing as the path narrowed further. After a few more turns, the trees finally fell away to reveal a small grassy clearing beside a bubbling brook. Sam pulled the truck to a stop and cut the engine with an air of relief. "Well, here we are," he said, glancing over at Melissa with a smile. "What do you think?" She opened her door and stepped out, taking in their secluded forest paradise bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. "It's beautiful. Nice and quiet. Just what we needed." With the trunk popped, they began unloading their camping supplies. Within the hour, their tent was pitched near the water's edge and a fire crackled merrily, cooking strips of venison for their dinner. As night fell, they sat by the fire sharing stories and gazing at the brilliant star-filled sky visible away from city light pollution. An owl hooted somewhere unseen, and the woods rose to life with the rustlings and calls of nocturnal creatures awakening all around them. "It's so peaceful out here," Melissa sighed contentedly. But not long after, as they prepared for bed, a strange sound drifted through the dark forest. A long, low howl rose and fell hauntingly close by. Sam and Melissa exchanged an uneasy look across the dying fire. "What was that?" she murmured, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "Sounded like a wolf, maybe a coyote," Sam replied, though without conviction. There weren't supposed to be wolves in these parts. In their tent, listening to the mysterious sounds continue. Neither could escape a rioting unease they couldn't quite place. Sleep came fitfully that night as the woods whispered all around in the blackness. When dawn's light finally filtered into their shelter, Sam unzipped the tent flap and crawled out. What he saw made him freeze in his tracks. Over by their supplies, the remnants of their food lay scattered, wrappers torn open, and crumbs strewn about. Something had been rummaging around in the night. "Melissa, get out here," Sam said in a low voice, and the worry in his tone had her hurrying to his side. She gasped at the mess. "A bear, you think?" Melissa asked, scanning the nearby brush apprehensively. Sam didn't respond, only continued scanning the area with a deepening frown. It wasn't much of a mess for a hungry bear, and there were no tracks, only the strange feeling they were being watched even now, from somewhere in the shadowy depths of the surrounding forest. As they cleaned up in tense silence, doubts lingered that it had been mere wildlife intruding after all. An ominous sense of unseen eyes upon them persisted for the rest of an uncomfortable morning, with an unspoken question hovering heavy between them. What exactly was lurking out there in the dense trees? The day dragged with no resolution to ease their unease. By late afternoon, Sam insisted they pack up early to leave under the looming clouds of an impending storm. They worked in hurried silence, shooting furtive glances into the encroaching foliage as dusk swiftly fell. Finally loaded and with rain spitting from the darkening sky, Sam started the truck and gunned the engine. But as they began pulling away, Melissa cried out suddenly. Through the downpour, she pointed at a dim figure standing statue, still among the skeletal trees at the tree line, hooded and featureless, merely observing them from the shadows. Sam slammed on the brakes and swerved to a stop, his own heart seizing in fright at the apparition. But when a flash of lightning briefly lit the woods, the specter was gone, as if it had never been. He threw the truck into gear and peeled out, dirt spraying as they fishtailed down the treacherous path, disappearing into the stormy night, both shaking with adrenaline and fear of what exactly had been watching them. The next morning found them huddled in their motel room, after a mostly sleepless night, clinging to each cup of weak coffee as the rain still lashed the windows. Finally, Sam broke the tense silence. "We should see if anyone in town knows anything about that place," he said gravely. "I've got a bad feeling about this." Melissa nodded hesitantly, and soon they were walking down the main street of the tiny mountain village, seeking answers. But the locals were a close-mouthed bunch, doors shutting quickly until one man took pity on their obvious distress. "Best be careful up in Carver's Valley," the grizzled old-timer warned over his newspaper. "That land's been cursed ever since Old Man Carver disappeared up there 20 years ago. Folks say his spirit still haunts the woods looking for victims. I wouldn't set foot there again if I was you." A haunted valley and a missing hermit. It certainly explained a few things, but one question still nagged at Sam's mind. Any disappearances since then? The man eyed them cautiously. "Folks go missing up there from time to time, sure enough, but the sheriff, he says it's probably bears or such. Personally, I ain't so sure." He lowered his voice. "You ask me. Carver's still up there, and he ain't alone neither. Mark my words, you leave evil be. It'll come drifting down from those woods one day." A chill crept up Sam's spine at the ominous warning, but Melissa was already pulling him away, eyes bright with an intuition he knew all too well. "We need to go back," she declared with resolve. "Tonight." He sighed, knowing full well there would be no dissuading her now. Whatever was haunting those woods had drawn her in like a moth to flame with her insatiable curiosity, and he'd do anything to keep her safe, even delve back into the heart of darkness with her. That evening found their truck bumping its way back up the old logging trail under a waning crescent moon. They parked at the edge and slipped silently into the dense woods with only small flashlights, to ward off the inky blackness pressing in from all sides. For over an hour, they stealthily worked their way through the forest, following vague trails and keeping alert for any signs of life in the otherwise still primeval wood. Just as Melissa was beginning to lose hope, her light fell upon something jutting incongruously among the foliage, the splintered remains of wooden stairs leading up into the trees. With bated breath, they ascended until emerging onto a small clearing. At its center stood an ancient, ramshackle cabin, windows dark and grimy, the whole structure leaning tiredly to one side, as if under the weight of untold secrets within. This, then, was the sinister carver's decrepit abode, and something told them answers would be found within, for better or worse. Grasping hands, Sam and Melissa steeled their nerves and began stealthily searching for a way inside. The door creaked open reluctantly to reveal the musty cabin interior, shadows flickering in their flashlight beams. Despite the late hour, no candles or lamps glowed within, only a thick layer of dust and cobwebs hinting at long abandonment. Stepping carefully over the warped floorboards, Sam and Melissa fanned out to investigate. Everything was coated in a fine grit, from the rusting pots and pans to the spiderwebbed windows shielding a panorama view of the silent valley below. In one crumbling armchair was a yellowed newspaper, its date April 12th, 1953, staring out at them from ages past. As Melissa brushed off more grime, a grainy photo stared back. An austere, wispy-haired man identified as Bartholomew Carver, resident hermit, declared missing without a trace the previous February after failing to make his annual supply run. "How strange," Melissa murmured, brushing dust from her hands. The man who lived here simply vanishing without explanation. Sam pondered the article's implications as he searched the lean to addition attached to the cabin's rear, finding only moth-eaten furs and farming tools crumbling with rust. His thoughts were interrupted by Melissa's call from the lone bedroom. There, tucked within the sagging mattress, was a small moleskin journal, its pages swollen and faded. Melissa attempted opening it carefully, but many sheets crumbled at her touch, revealing sketchy, spidery scrawl chronicling Carver's strange life in these very woods over 3 decades prior. November 8th, 1920, 2. A most peculiar sighting in the forest glade tonight. The others stir, but remain shrouded. I feel their hunger and long for the coming convergence. January 2nd, 1923. Another livestock butchered on the South Ridge. The tracks lead here as I knew they would. I've invited them inside at last, and soon we shall feast together. February 19th, 1930, 8. They whisper of the girl in emerald who wanders too far from the road. Her sweet song shall call the others, and in the pooling glade their hunger shall be sated. The entries grew steadily more disturbing and nonsensical. Melissa snapped the book shut involuntarily, shivering at its implications. Had Carver truly gone mad in isolation? Or were there more sinister forces at work in this accursed valley? As they departed the ramshackle abode under waning moonlight, Melissa noticed the sleek furrows of enormous paw prints in the damp soil, far too large to be any natural creature. Her blood ran cold at this final confirmation that something unnatural indeed lurked within these shadowy depths. Whatever Carver had first encountered in the forest so long ago had only festered and grown in number over the decades. Now, it seemed their presence had been sensed, and malice had set its sights on new prey within its ancient domain. They had to leave, and leave now. But as they crashed through the undergrowth, a piercing, unearthly shriek rent the night behind them, freezing them in their tracks. Lights now dotted the hillsides in reply, as if drawn by that bone-chilling cry. They were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. And whatever stalked these woods was closing in for the kill. Sam grabbed Melissa's wrist and broke into a desperate sprint, branches tearing at their clothes as unseen pursuers gave chase. With labored breaths, they reached the truck, scrambled inside, and Sam jammed the keys into the ignition. But as the engine whined in protest, a colossal, man-like figure detached from the gloom, malice burning in its wild, inhuman eyes. It lunged without warning at the driver's side window, and Sam gunned the gas just in time. Their truck tore off into the night as unearthly howls of rage and famine chased them down the winding road, fleeing with their lives from the soulless abomination that had lurked in those cursed woods for over a century, and still remained, awaiting its next victims. Their harrowing flight through the dense forest was a blur of dodged trees and adrenaline. Sam swung the wheel wildly, aiming blindly for any sign of civilization, while strained eyes searched the surrounding blackness for pursuers. But then, with a lurching jolt, one rear wheel caught in a dug rut, launching the vehicle into a crazed spin. They careened helplessly toward an embankment before slamming to a halt against thick trunks. For a long moment, Sam and Melissa sat stunned, as silent and still as the lifeless woods enveloping their disabled vehicle. Then shuddering breaths shattered the fragile calm as danger's imminence crashed back in full force. They were stranded, lost deep in this primal forest hollow where unnatural terrors stalked, isolated from all aid or escape. A light flickered behind sepulchral trees, twin orbs hovering like malignant fireflies. Their hellish light revealed grinning maws dripping with want, hungering after so long in solitude's shadows. Melissa's shaking hand found Sam's in the darkness, gripped tight for comfort against unspoken fears. He squeezed back determinedly and, shouldering his pack, kicked open the truck door. "Run," he rasped, and they plunged into the phantom woodland once more. Spectral howls rang out in pursuit through the mist. Swaddled forest, creatures from man's deepest nightmares, giving chase. Sam yanked Melissa onward, desperately, breath heaving in lung. Burning panic. Branches whipped, cruel barbs across their flailing forms. But pain served only to fuel flight's fervor. A clearing suddenly opened ahead, feeble moonlight casting the grassy dell aglow. But within that glade's heart remained denser shadows, light unwilling or unable to pierce the darkness there. An inky void residing where none should be, an opening into nothingness itself. And floating upon that Stygian surface, a hooded shape materialized. Long fingers grasping, lipless grin oozing malice. It knew them, as it knew all who strayed too near its domain. This place was no natural part of the wood, but a rip in the veil twixt this reality, and the next where nameless old ones lurked, eager to pull back stray mortals into the abyss. It reached now for the fleeing lovers, to drag them into the night that existed outside of night. But in that moment, as relentless as their pursuit, something else erupted from the woods. A towering, burly figure wielding an aged rifle. "Carver!" the hermit bellowed, taking aim. It seemed the forester yet prowled these haunted woods, defending his accursed home from the encroaching otherness. And with his protection, Sam dragged Melissa into a final full-throttle dash for salvation's faint glow beyond the tree line. Civilization, help, an end to the terror that had stalked them through this primordial forest of twisted entities and buried secrets since first setting foot within its borders. They broke free of claustrophobic trunks into the cool night, panting with relief. Behind, an unholy shriek rose from the mist, cloaked woodland, its guardians driven once more to fester in umbrous isolation. For now, the forest's dark mystery remained safely obscured within nature's veiled depths. But its riddles were far from solved, and the valley's grim legend would persist, hiding terrors that perhaps mankind was never meant to know.